Blood doesn't smell like pennies, no matter what they tell you in the movies. It smells like hot rust, wet dirt, and something deeply, uncomfortably sweet. Toby learned that on a Tuesday at 3 in the morning, lying on the cracked asphalt of a diner parking lot with a piece of a broken beer bottle lodged in his ribs. He didn't want to be a hero. He just wanted to finish his shift. But you don't always get what you want. The neon sign in the window of Hank's 24-hour eatery hummed with the angry, erratic buzz of a trapped wasp. Half the letters were burnt out, leaving the word eatery glowing a sickly, flickering pink against the relentless black of the Pennsylvania night. Inside, Toby leaned against the counter, a gray rag dangling from his left hand. He was 17, built like a whippet that had missed too many meals, with dark bags under his eyes that made him look a decade older. The diner smelled intensely of old fry grease, stale coffee, and the sharp chemical bite of cheap bleach. It was the kind of smell that settled into your pores and ruined your clothes permanently. There were only 2 customers. In the corner booth, nursing a mug of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, was a girl. She looked around 16, though her heavy eyeliner and the rigid set of her jaw tried to add years she hadn't earned. She wore an oversized black hoodie, the sleeves pushed up to reveal bruised, dirt-smudged forearms, and a heavy leather vest layered over it. The vest had no patches on the front, just black leather worn smooth at the edges. She kept checking her phone, tapping the cracked screen with a fingernail bitten down to the quick. Toby didn't know her name, but he knew the type. She belonged to the highway, waiting for a ride that was either going to be an hour late or wasn't coming at all. The other customer was Trouble. He was a local regular Toby only knew as Toad, a wide, thick-necked man with a patchy beard and eyes that swam in a yellowish haze of meth and cheap bourbon. Toad had been sitting at the counter for 20 minutes, tearing a paper napkin into microscopic shreds, radiating a twitchy, sour energy. "Hey, kid," Toad rasped, his voice sounding like boots crunching over gravel. "More coffee." Toby didn't say anything. He picked up the glass carafe, its bottom ringed with burnt residue, and poured the black sludge into Toad's mug. Toad didn't look at the cup. He was looking at the girl in the booth. "She waiting for someone?" Toad asked, a wet smirk stretching his chapped lips. "Don't know," Toby said, setting the pot back on the burner. "Not my business." "Skinny little thing," Toad muttered, leaning heavily on the laminate counter. He smelled of unwashed clothes and sour beer. "Shouldn't be out this late. Dangerous." Toby turned his back, aggressively scrubbing at a coffee stain that had been baked into the counter since the 90s. His stomach gave a dull, warning throb. He hated the graveyard shift. It was a magnet for the broken, the lost, and the violent. The girl stood up. She tossed a crumpled dollar bill onto the table, slinging a heavy canvas backpack over one shoulder. She didn't look at Toby, and she definitely didn't look at Toad. She just pushed through the heavy glass door, the bells jingling cheerfully, a jarring sound against the heavy atmosphere of the room. Toby watched her walk out into the parking lot. It had started to rain, a thin misting drizzle that slicked the asphalt and caught the pink neon light in greasy puddles. Behind him, a stool screeched against the linoleum. Toby turned. Toad was up. He hadn't touched his fresh coffee. He shoved his hands deep into the pockets of his stained denim jacket and shambled toward the door, his heavy boots squeaking on the wet floor. "Hey," Toby said, the word slipping out before his brain could catch it. Toad paused, hand on the glass door. He looked back, his eyes dead and glassy. "What? You owe $1.50 for the coffee." It was a stupid thing to say. Toby didn't care about the diner's profit margins, but his pulse was suddenly hammering in his throat, a primal instinct flaring up in the base of his skull. Toad just stared at him. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a handful of lint-covered coins, and let them drop onto the floor. They hit the linoleum with a series of flat, dull clinks. Toad smiled, a slow, ugly thing, and walked out into the rain. Toby stood frozen for 3 seconds. The rational part of his brain screamed at him to stay behind the counter. "It's not your problem. Lock the door. Call the cops if it gets loud." But he knew the cops in this county. They'd take 20 minutes just to dispatch a car, and another 20 to show up. He looked at the coins on the floor. Then, he grabbed the heavy metal flashlight from beneath the cash register. Its handle was cold and knurled, a comforting weight in his sweating palm. He pushed through the door. The cold air hit him like a wet towel. The parking lot was cast in deep shadows, broken only by the flickering neon sign and the yellow glare of a lone streetlight near the highway on-ramp. Toby stepped out from under the awning. The rain was freezing, instantly soaking through his thin uniform shirt. He heard it before he saw it, a sharp, frightened intake of breath, followed by the heavy, wet thud of someone being shoved against a car. He moved toward the blind side of the diner, near the overflowing dumpsters. The stench of rotting garbage and wet cardboard was overpowering. Toad had the girl pinned against the rusted side of an old, abandoned Buick. He had one thick hand wrapped around her throat, pressing her back, while his other hand fumbled aggressively with the zipper of her vest. "Just calm down, you little bitch," Toad was hissing, his breath pluming in the cold air. The girl wasn't screaming. She was fighting like a cornered animal. She brought her knee up, aiming for his groin, but Toad shifted his weight, taking the hit on his thigh. He grunted, his hand tightening on her throat. She clawed at his face, her short nails dragging across his cheek, leaving bright red tracks. "Hey!" Toby yelled. His voice cracked. It sounded small, pathetic, swallowed entirely by the vast, empty night. Toad jerked his head around. In the dim light, the scratches on his face were already welling with blood. He looked annoyed, like Toby was a mosquito buzzing in his ear. "Get back inside, kid," Toad spat, turning his attention back to the girl. Toby didn't have a plan. He wasn't a fighter. He had never been in a real fight in his life. He usually survived by being invisible. But the sight of Toad's heavy hand crushing the girl's throat made something snap in his chest. It wasn't bravery. It was a sudden violent surge of nausea and anger. He rushed forward, raising the heavy maglite. He swung it clumsily, aiming for Toad's head. He missed. The heavy metal cylinder clipped Toad's shoulder, glancing off the bone with a dull thwack. It was enough to break Toad's grip on the girl. She slipped sideways, coughing violently, her hands going to her bruised neck as she scrambled away along the side of the car. Toad spun around, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He didn't look like a sloppy drunk anymore. He looked fast and heavy and incredibly dangerous. "You stupid little shit," Toad growled. Toby swung the flashlight again, but he was off balance, his sneakers slipping on the greasy asphalt. Toad stepped inside the arc of the swing, moving with a surprising, terrifying speed. Toad's fist hit Toby's jaw like a brick wrapped in sandpaper. The world tilted. Toby's teeth clamped down on his tongue, filling his mouth with the hot metallic taste of copper. He stumbled backward, his vision swimming, the neon sign spinning into a streak of pink light. Before he could recover, Toad grabbed the front of his shirt, hauling him close. The smell of Toad was suffocating, sweat, rot, and stale alcohol. "You want to be a hero?" Toad whispered, spit flying into Toby's face. Toad threw a knee directly into Toby's stomach. All the air left Toby's lungs in a wet gasp. He folded forward, dropping the flashlight. It hit the ground and rolled away, the beam cutting a chaotic path through the rain. Toby was dimly aware of the girl screaming now, yelling at Toad to stop, but her voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. He hit the ground, scraping his palms on the coarse gravel. He tried to scramble backward, coughing, trying to drag oxygen into his paralyzed lungs. Toad loomed over him, reaching into his pocket. When Toad's hand came out, the dim yellow light caught the jagged edge of a broken beer bottle. The glass was dark green, thick and wicked. Toby raised his hands, kicking his feet, trying to scuttle away. "No, wait, man, stop!" Toad lunged. It didn't feel like getting cut. There was no sharp pain. It felt like being punched in the side, just below the ribs, with a blunt, heavy object. There was a sickening, tearing sound, like thick canvas ripping. Toby gasped, his eyes going wide. He looked down. Toad stepped back, breathing heavily. The broken bottle was gone. Toby's hands flew to his side. His fingers slipped against something hot, wet, and incredibly thick. The jagged base of the glass bottle was protruding from his ribcage, right through his uniform shirt. The pain hit a second later. It wasn't a localized ache. It was a roaring, blinding fire that radiated from his side, consuming his chest, his spine, plunging deep into his organs. It was a pain so total, so absolute, that it wiped his mind blank. He opened his mouth to scream, but all that came out was a wet, choking gurgle. He collapsed onto his back, hitting the puddle-strewn asphalt. The cold rain hit his face, a sharp contrast to the boiling heat spilling from his side. Through the haze of agony, he saw Toad staring down at him. The man's face went slack. The rage vanished, replaced instantly by the coward's panic. Toad had wanted to hurt someone, maybe scare a kid, but the reality of the dark, spreading pool of blood on the wet pavement sobered him up instantly. "Shit," Toad muttered, taking a step back. "Shit." He turned and bolted, his heavy boots pounding against the asphalt, disappearing into the thick darkness behind the dumpsters. Toby lay there, staring up at the rain falling through the halo of the streetlight. He couldn't breathe. Every time he tried to inhale, the broken glass grated against his ribs, sending a shockwave of white-hot agony through his nervous system. His vision was tunneling, the edges of the world turning gray and fuzzy. "I'm dying," he thought. It wasn't a panicked thought. It was remarkably clear, heavy, and sad. "I'm dying in a parking lot over a $1.50 coffee. Hey, look at me!" A face shoved its way into his fading line of sight. It was the girl. Her hood had fallen back, plastering dark, wet hair to her cheeks. Her eyeliner had run, carving black, muddy tracks down her pale face. She dropped to her knees beside him. The asphalt scraped against the heavy leather of her vest. "Don't pull it out," she ordered, her voice trembling but remarkably authoritative. "Leave your hands where they are." Toby tried to nod, but his head felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. His hands were coated in a slick, warm syrup. He could smell it now, that heavy, rusted iron scent cutting through the smell of the rain and the garbage. The girl ripped off her heavy canvas backpack. She unzipped it with frantic, jerky movements, digging past clothes and a makeup bag, finally pulling out a thick gray sweatshirt. "This is going to hurt," she said, her voice dropping an octave. She pressed the bunched-up sweatshirt directly against the wound, packing it tight around the jagged glass protruding from his side. Toby screamed. It was a raw, tearing sound that ripped up his throat. His back arched off the pavement, his boots kicking uselessly against the ground. The pressure was excruciating. I know, I'm sorry," she chanted, leaning her entire body weight onto her hands, pressing down on the wadded fabric. "You gotta stay still. You're bleeding fast. I gotta keep the pressure." Toby squeezed his eyes shut, tears mixing with the rain on his face. "Cold," he whispered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. The heat was leaving his body, draining out onto the pavement. A deep, bone-deep freeze was seeping into his extremities. "I know," she said, her breath hitching. She was straddling him now, using her knees to pin his thrashing arms to his sides while keeping all her weight on his ribs. "Stay with me. What's your name?" "Toby," he stammered, his lips numb. "Okay, Toby, I'm Chloe." She kept her eyes locked on his, dark and fierce. "You're going to be okay. You hear me?" Toby didn't answer. He couldn't. The edges of his vision were closing in faster now. With one hand maintaining the agonizing pressure on his side, Chloe dug into the front pocket of her jeans with the other. She pulled out her phone. The screen was cracked, spiderwebbed with glass, but it illuminated her face in a harsh blue light. Toby watched her thumb swipe across the screen, leaving a smear of his own blood on the glass. She didn't dial 911. She hit a speed dial contact. She held the phone to her ear, pinning it to her shoulder. The phone rang once, twice. "Dad," Chloe said. Her voice broke on the word. The tough facade crumbled entirely, leaving just a terrified 16-year-old girl in the rain. Toby couldn't hear the voice on the other end, but he heard the sharp, metallic snap of the tone. It wasn't the voice of a sleepy father. It was sharp, awake, and immediately demanding. "I'm at the diner," Chloe cried, tears finally spilling over her lashes. "The one off exit 42. Hanks." Pause. No, I'm okay. I'm okay. But, Dad, a guy attacked me, a local. He had a knife, a bottle. She choked on a sob, looking down at Toby. The kid who works here, he stepped in. He tried to stop him. Dad, he got stabbed. He got stabbed bad. He's bleeding out. The voice on the phone was louder now, a low, rumbling vibration that Toby could almost feel through the wet air. I have pressure on it, Chloe said, her voice rising in panic. But it's a lot of blood. Dad, there's so much blood. Pause. A thick guy. Beard. Jean jacket. He ran toward the woods behind the diner. Dad, please, he saved me. He's dying. The line went dead. Chloe let the phone drop onto the wet pavement. Toby looked at her, his breathing shallow, rapid, and shallow. Kick cops, he wheezed. Ambulance? Chloe looked down at him. Her expression was a strange mix of profound grief and a terrifying, cold certainty. She shifted her weight, pressing harder on the wound, ignoring his whimper of pain. I called them too, she lied, her voice dropping to a whisper. But they're far away. She leaned in closer, the heavy leather of her vest brushing against Toby's cheek. For the first time, in the dim light of the dropped phone, Toby saw the faint outline of a stitched logo on the inside lining of her jacket, a winged skull, barely visible in the shadows. My dad is closer, Chloe whispered, her eyes dark and hollow. Just hold on, Toby. They're coming. Toby didn't know who they were, but the way she said it didn't sound like a rescue. It sounded like a promise of absolute violence. He closed his eyes, letting the darkness finally drag him under, the last sound in his ears not a siren, but the distant low thunder of an engine on the highway. Consciousness didn't return all at once. It came in broken, jagged shards, like the glass still buried in Toby's ribs. He felt the cold first. It was a terrifying, hollow chill that seemed to radiate from his marrow outward. The rain was still falling, but it felt distant, tapping against his skin like tiny freezing needles. The weight on his chest was immense. Chloe was still there, her hands locked over the ruined fabric of his shirt, her sobbing reduced to a dry, rhythmic hitch in her throat. Then came the vibration. It didn't start as a sound. It started as a tremor deep in the wet asphalt, traveling through the puddles, up through Toby's spine, and rattling the base of his skull. It was a heavy mechanical heartbeat. Thump, 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 thump. The noise followed a second later, a low, guttural roar tearing through the damp night air. It wasn't the high-pitched wail of an ambulance siren. It was the sound of controlled explosions. Headlights slashed across the diner parking lot, blindingly bright, cutting through the rain in solid beams of white. 3 motorcycles tore off the highway off-ramp, taking the turn so hard their floorboards threw sparks against the concrete. They didn't park in the designated spots. They rolled straight onto the sidewalk, jumping the curb, the massive V-twin engines echoing off the brick walls of the diner like artillery fire. Before the kickstands even scraped the ground, the riders were off. Chloe! The voice was a concussive blast. A man broke away from the lead bike. In the chaotic strobing of the neon sign and the headlights, Toby only registered size. The man was a wall of black denim and heavy leather, moving with a desperate, terrifying momentum. Hey, Dad! Chloe screamed, her voice cracking. She didn't let go of Toby. Her knuckles were white. The man, Clay, hit the ground on his knees, sliding the last 2 feet on the wet asphalt. He grabbed Chloe by the shoulders, his massive hand scanning her face, her neck, checking for blood that was hers. I'm okay, she choked out, her entire body shaking now that the adrenaline was crashing. It's him, Dad, it's him. Clay looked down, his eyes, pale and sharp beneath a heavy brow, locked onto Toby. Toby tried to swallow, but his throat was glued shut. He expected the man to push him aside, to grab his daughter and leave him to bleed. Instead, Clay's expression shifted. The frantic father vanished, replaced instantly by a man who understood violence intimately. Dex! Clay barked, not looking up. Get the kit. Now. One of the other riders, a towering man with a braided beard, sprinted to a saddlebag. Clay leaned over Toby. He smelled of exhaust fumes, wet leather, and stale cigarette smoke, a harsh, heavy scent that grounded Toby, pulling him slightly back from the edge of the gray tunnel. "Kid," Clay said, his voice dropping to a gravelly murmur. "Look at me. Keep your eyes on me." Toby forced his eyes to focus. "Hurts," he whispered, a pathetic, reedy sound. "I know it does," Clay said. He reached out, his thick fingers replacing Chloe's on the blood-soaked sweatshirt. "You did good. You did real good. But I need to press harder now. You're going to hate me for it." Toby didn't have time to brace himself. Clay shoved his weight down. A fresh wave of agony hit Toby so hard his vision whited out. He bucked, a strangled cry tearing from his throat. Someone grabbed his legs, pinning them to the asphalt. "Hold him down, Dutch," Clay ordered. "He thrashes. He cuts the artery." "Got him, boss," a voice grunted from near Toby's boots. Dex appeared, dropping a heavy black trauma kit onto the pavement. He didn't bother with bandages. He pulled out a thick wad of hemostatic gauze. "Ambulance is 4 minutes out. Scanner says they're taking the back roads because of the flooding on Route 9. "We don't have 4 minutes," Clay gritted out, his hands slick with Toby's blood. He looked at his daughter. Chloe was backed up against the rusted Buick, hugging her knees, staring at Toby with wide, traumatized eyes. "Chloe," Clay said, his voice snapping like a whip, "look at me." She flinched, pulling her gaze away from the blood. Who did this? It wasn't a question asked out of curiosity. It was a tactical inquiry. "Local," she stuttered, her teeth chattering. "Heavy, patchy beard, smelled like meth. He ran back there." She pointed a trembling finger toward the woods behind the dumpsters. Clay didn't turn his head. He just gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to Dex. Dex stood up. The rain plastered his gray hair to his skull. He walked to his bike, reached into the deep pocket of his leather cut, and pulled out a heavy matte black flashlight. He didn't run. He just walked toward the darkness behind the diner, his heavy boots crunching rhythmically on the gravel. A siren finally pierced the night, a high, desperate wail growing louder. The flashing red and blue lights washed over the parking lot, painting the chrome of the motorcycles in alternating colors. The paramedics jumped out before the rig fully stopped, grabbing their gurney and bags. But they froze for a fraction of a second when they saw the scene. 3 massive, heavily patched bikers covered in blood, surrounding a dying kid. "Move!" Clay roared, his voice cutting through the siren. The hesitation broke. The medics rushed in. Clay didn't step back until the medic's hands physically replaced his own on the wound. "Vitals are crashing," the lead medic yelled, slapping a pressure dressing over the gauze. "We need to load him now." Toby felt himself being lifted. The world spun dizzily. The rain stopped hitting his face as they shoved the gurney into the back of the rig. The harsh fluorescent lights of the ambulance interior stabbed at his eyes. Before the door slammed shut, a massive blood-stained hand grabbed the edge of the metal frame. Clay leaned his head in. "You keep him breathing," Clay told the medic. It wasn't a request. "You understand me?" The medic, pale and sweating, just nodded. The door slammed. The rig lurched forward. Toby stared at the white ceiling, the vibration of the road humming through the mattress, pulling him down, down, down into the quiet dark. The smell of rust and rain was gone. In its place was a sharp, clinical sterility that burned the back of the sinuses. Bleach, iodine. The faint, sweet smell of latex gloves. Toby opened his eyes. The light was too bright. A flat, shadowless white that hurt his brain. He tried to blink it away, but his eyelids felt like sandpaper. He tried to swallow, but his mouth was packed with dry cotton. A steady, rhythmic beep echoed near his left ear. He moved his arm, and a sharp tug at the back of his hand made him wince. An IV line was taped securely to his skin, trailing up to a clear bag of fluid. Slowly, the memory of the parking lot came rushing back. The crack of the bottle, the burning heat, the rain. He braced himself for the crushing pain in his side, but it wasn't there. Instead, there was a dull, heavy throbbing, numb and distant, buried under a thick, warm blanket of chemical euphoria. Morphine. He was in a hospital bed, a private room. He turned his head to the right. Sitting in a miserable plastic visitor's chair that was comically too small for him was Clay. The biker hadn't changed clothes. His heavy leather vest was still on. The bottom half of his denim jeans soaked dark with rainwater and dried blood. He was leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees, staring intently at his own massive hands. The faint hiss of an oxygen mask down the hall was the only sound besides the heart monitor. Toby made a small, dry noise in the back of his throat. Clay's head snapped up. The exhaustion on his face was etched deep into the heavy lines around his mouth, but his eyes were instantly alert. He stood up, the plastic chair groaning in relief, and stepped to the edge of the bed. He didn't say anything at first. He just reached over to a small plastic pitcher on the tray table, poured water into a tiny cup, and dropped a plastic straw into it. He held it to Toby's lips. Toby drank greedily, the cool water feeling like absolute salvation on his cracked throat. He slumped back into the pillows, his chest rising and falling in a shallow, careful breaths. "Where?" Toby rasped, his voice sounding like two pieces of rough grit rubbing together. "County General," Clay said. His voice was a low rumble, intentionally kept quiet, but it still filled the sterile room. "You've been out for 14 hours. Surgery took 3. Glass missed your lung by half an inch, but it tore up your oblique and nicked an artery." Toby processed this slowly. The morphine made his thoughts sluggish, floating like oil on water. "Chloe?" he asked. "She's safe," Clay said, a muscle feathering in his jaw. "She's at the clubhouse, sleeping." Clay leaned back, hooking his thumbs into the pockets of his jeans. He looked entirely out of place in the bright, clean room. He looked like a piece of rough iron dropped into a porcelain bowl. "The nurses are terrified of you," Toby mumbled, a faint, dopey smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "They asked me to leave the waiting room," Clay said flatly. "I declined." Toby closed his eyes. The drugs were making him float, but a dark, anxious current was starting to pull at his chest. He wasn't a hero. He was a skinny kid who made minimum wage and failed pre-calc. He remembered the blinding terror he felt when Toad pulled the bottle. He remembered wanting to run away. I didn't know what I was doing," Toby whispered, staring at the ceiling tiles. I asked him to pay for his coffee. It was stupid. I just made him mad." "You swung a flashlight at a guy twice your size to get him off my daughter," Clay corrected him, his voice hardening. "I missed," Toby pointed out, feeling a flush of pathetic shame. Clay stepped closer, resting one heavy hand on the metal rail of the hospital bed. The smell of tobacco and old leather washed over Toby again. "Kid," Clay said, locking eyes with him. "Listen to me. The world is full of people who see something bad happening, and they look at their shoes. They walk the other way. They tell themselves it ain't their problem. You didn't do that. You stepped into the teeth." Toby swallowed hard. He felt exposed, small. "I was terrified." "Good. Means you ain't crazy," Clay said, the ghost of a grim smile touching his lips. "Brave doesn't mean you ain't scared. It just means you step up anyway." Silence stretched between them, heavy and weighted. Toby could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. "I owe you," Clay said suddenly. The words weren't spoken lightly. They were spoken like a blood oath, heavy and absolute. Toby's heart rate ticked up a notch on the monitor. He didn't want this man to owe him. He didn't want to be entangled in whatever violent, shadowy world this leather vest represented. "You don't owe me anything, man," Toby said quickly, his voice tight. "I'm just glad she's okay. Seriously, we're good." Clay stared at him, his pale eyes unblinking. "You don't understand how this works. You bled for mine. That means you're mine now. Anyone touches you, anyone looks at you wrong in this town, they answer to the club. The hospital bill? Handled. Your wages at that shithole diner? Covered." Toby felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. "You really don't have to." "It's done," Clay interrupted, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy silver Zippo lighter. He flipped it open and shut, an anxious, rhythmic tick. Clack, clack. What about the guy? Toby asked, the memory of Toad's yellow teeth and rotting breath making his stomach turn. Did the cops get him? Clay stopped flipping the lighter. He slowly slid it back into his pocket, his face drained of whatever trace of warmth had been there, leaving behind a cold, terrifying mask of dead stone. Cops didn't find him, Clay said quietly. But don't you worry about him, Toby. He's not going to be a problem for anyone ever again. A chill ran down Toby's spine that had nothing to do with the IV fluids. He looked at Clay's eyes and saw exactly what had happened in the 14 hours he'd been asleep. He didn't ask any more questions. He just closed his eyes, pretending the morphine was pulling him under again, 12 hours earlier. The town of Oakhaven was a rusty, forgotten place. It sat on the edge of the Appalachian foothills, a town built on timber and coal that had slowly suffocated when the mills shut down. At 4:30 in the morning, it was usually silent, save for the hum of the highway and the wind moving through the pines. But not this morning. The call had gone out at 3:15 a.m. By 4:45 a.m., the staging ground was the empty dirt lot behind an abandoned strip mall on the edge of town. They arrived not in a chaotic swarm, but in a disciplined, relentless stream. Headlights cut through the pre-dawn fog like predator eyes. The deep, concussive rumble of heavy V-twin engines vibrated through the cracked asphalt, shaking the windows of the boarded-up storefronts. They wore the winged skull, 200 riders. There was no shouting. There was no chaotic revving of engines. It was a terrifyingly quiet mobilization. The bikes parked in tight, organized rows. Men in heavy boots and rain-soaked leather dismounted in the damp chill, moving with grim, military precision. The air filled with the thick smell of unburned hydrocarbons, wet denim, and the sulfur strike of matches lighting cheap cigarettes. Clay stood at the front of the pack, leaning against the hood of a rusted-out pickup truck. Dex and Dutch stood on either side of him. A local county sheriff's cruiser had pulled into the far end of the lot 10 minutes prior. The lone deputy inside had rolled down his window, stared at the sea of leather and chrome, picked up his radio, and then slowly rolled his window back up. He hadn't turned on his flashers. He just sat there, acting as a highly visible, entirely useless spectator. He knew the math, 200 to 1. You don't police a tide. You just try not to drown in it. Dex stepped up to Clay. He held a crumpled, greasy baseball cap in his massive hand. Found this in the briars behind the dumpsters at the diner, Dex grunted, his voice a low rumble. Smells like a meth lab. Clay took the hat. He didn't look at it. He squeezed it in his fist until his knuckles popped. We got a name, Dutch added, stepping forward. Dutch was younger, wires tight, chewing aggressively on a toothpick. Local tweaker who lives down off Route 9, goes by Toad, rents a rusted-out Airstream behind the old tire fire yard. Got a rap sheet a mile long. Aggravated assault, possession, domestic. Cops know him well. Are the cops looking for him? Clay asked, his voice dead flat. They put a car by his trailer, Dutch spat, spitting the toothpick into the dirt. But the guy is rabbiting. He knows he stabbed a kid. What he doesn't know is who the girl was. Clay looked out over the sea of faces in front of him. 200 men, brothers. They were rough, violent, imperfect men who lived by a code the rest of the world found abhorrent. But right now, they were a weapon, and Clay had his hand firmly on the trigger. He touched my daughter, Clay said. He didn't yell. He didn't have to. In the absolute silence of the lot, his voice carried. He put a bottle through a kid who stood up for her. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. It wasn't a cheer. It was an acknowledgement. The cops are going to look for him when the sun comes up and they have their coffee, Clay continued, dropping the greasy baseball cap into the mud at his boots. We are not waiting for the sun. He turned to Dutch. Split them into packs of 10. Lock down the highway ramps, north and south. Nobody leaves this county without us seeing their face. He pointed a thick finger at Dex. You take 20 to the trailer. If the cops are there, you sit on the perimeter. If he slips the net, he's going to the woods. He's going to ground. And when we find him, Dex asked, his face cast in shadow beneath the brim of his helmet. Clay didn't answer immediately. He looked up at the sky, the heavy black clouds finally starting to bleed into a bruised charcoal gray. The rain had stopped, leaving everything dripping and cold. He thought of the blood on his hands. He thought of the terrified, pale kid lying on the wet asphalt, clutching his own guts to save a girl he didn't even know. "When you find him," Clay said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, hollow whisper, "you break his leg so he can't run. Then you call me." Engines began to turn over. First one, then 10, then 50. The sound swelled from a rumble to a deafening, chest-crushing roar. The exhaust fumes rose into the damp air like smoke from a battlefield. They rolled out of the dirt lot in tight formation. They didn't speed. They didn't ride recklessly. They moved like a mechanized wolf pack fanning out across the territory. Toad was somewhere in the dark, shivering in the damp woods, thinking he had merely committed a felony. He thought he was hiding from the law. He had no idea that the law was the safest thing he could hope for. The town of Oakhaven was waking up, and the devil was already riding through its streets. The methamphetamine was leaving Toad's system, peeling away in aggressive, jagged layers. When he had first bolted into the tree line behind the diner, he felt indestructible, fueled by a panicked chemical fire. Now, 4 hours later, that fire was dead ash. He was deep in the state game lands, miles from the highway. The woods were dense with briar patches and rotting deadfall. His boots were caked in heavy sucking clay. Every step was a negotiation with gravity. The damp cold had seeped through his denim jacket, nesting in his bones, making his teeth click together uncontrollably. He stopped against the slick bark of a massive oak, gasping for air. His lungs burned. He wiped his face with a trembling, filth-covered hand. He tasted salt and copper. He'd bitten his tongue somewhere along the way. Just a kid, he told himself, trying to rationalize the rising tide of dread in his gut. Just a stupid kid at a diner. Cops won't bring dogs for that. I just gotta lay low until tomorrow, hitch a ride to Scranton. He reached into his pocket, his fingers blindly searching for a loose cigarette, but only found wet lint. He cursed, his voice a pathetic reedy rasp in the vast silence of the woods. But it wasn't silent. Toad froze. He turned his head slowly, the muscles in his thick neck locking up. It was a low sound, felt more in the sternum than heard by the ears. A dull, rhythmic vibration, thrum, thrum, thrum. He knew that sound. Everyone who grew up in the rusty, forgotten pockets of the Rust Belt knew that sound. It was the idle of heavy, modified V-twin engines. It wasn't just one. It was dozens. The sound was coming from the county road to the east. Toad's paranoid, exhausted brain tried to dismiss it. A charity ride, a rally, a coincidence. Then he heard the same sound coming from the logging road to the west. A heavy, synchronized thunder rolling through the damp pines. They were boxing the grid. The girl. The realization hit Toad like a physical blow to the stomach. The black leather vest. The heavy boots. The way she hadn't screamed when he first grabbed her, just fought back with a feral, learned violence. "Oh, God!" Toad whimpered, a sudden violent surge of nausea doubling him over. He retched dryly, spitting stringy saliva into the dead leaves. He wasn't running from the sheriff. He was running from a ghost story. Panic, absolute and blinding, hijacked his nervous system. He pushed off the oak tree and started to run. It wasn't a tactical retreat anymore. It was the chaotic, thrashing sprint of a prey animal. Thorns tore at his face and snagged his clothes, leaving thin, stinging lines of blood across his cheeks. He tripped over a submerged root, slamming hard into the mud, biting his lip so hard it split. He scrambled back up, spitting dirt, tears of pure terror mixing with the grime on his face. He saw the concrete lip of an old drainage culvert ahead, half buried under a tangle of blackberry bushes. It was a dark, wet hole, reeking of stagnant water and rotting algae. But it was a hole. He dove for it, sliding on his belly through the slick mud, wedging his broad shoulders into the narrow concrete pipe. He dragged himself back a few feet, pulling his knees to his chest, sinking into the freezing, ankle-deep muck. He held his breath. His heart was hammering against his ribs with enough force to crack them. He listened. The deep rumble of the engines had stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was thick, heavy, and expectant. Toad pressed his forehead against the cold concrete of the pipe, squeezing his eyes shut. Crunch. A heavy boot stepped on a dead branch directly above his head. Toad clamped both hands over his own mouth to stifle a whimper. Dust and dried mud sifted down from the roof of the culvert, landing in his hair. Crunch. Splash. Someone had jumped down into the drainage ditch just outside the pipe. Toad slowly opened his eyes. The gray, watery light of dawn was just beginning to filter through the trees. At the mouth of the culvert, silhouetted against the pale light, was a man. He was massive, built like a brick wall wearing a leather cut. Rainwater dripped from a long, braided gray beard. Dex didn't lean down to look inside. He didn't unholster a weapon. He just stood there, unhurried, pulling a heavy black maglite from his belt. The same kind of flashlight the kid at the diner had swung at Toad. Dex clicked it on. The beam hit Toad directly in the face, blinding him instantly. Toad threw his hands up, a pathetic squeaking noise escaping his throat. "Found him," Dex said. He didn't shout. He spoke at a normal conversational volume, addressing the woods around him. From the trees above, 4 more sets of heavy boots dropped into the ditch, the mud squelching under their weight. Toad tried to scramble backward, but the pipe narrowed. He was trapped. Hey, man, look!" Toad pleaded, his voice breaking into a high-pitched sob. "It was a mistake. I was drunk. I didn't know who she was. I swear to God, I didn't know." The flashlight beam didn't waver. "Crawl out," Dex commanded. The voice was devoid of anger. It was completely mechanical. "I got money," Toad lied desperately, pressing his back against the slime-coated concrete. "I can get cash. Just let me go. I'll leave the state. You'll never see me again." Dex reached into the pipe. His massive hand locked onto the collar of Toad's denim jacket, bunching the thick fabric in a grip that felt like industrial machinery. With one sharp, brutal yank, Dex dragged the 200-pound man out of the culvert like a rag doll. Toad hit the mud outside the pipe, sprawling on his back. He threw his arms up, expecting a kick, expecting the glint of a knife. The 5 men just stood in a circle around him. They looked down at him with an expression of profound, tired boredom. There was no rage in their eyes. They looked at Toad the way a mechanic looks at a rusted bolt that needs to be ground off. "Hold his legs," Dex grunted, handing the flashlight to the man next to him. "No, wait, please," Toad screamed, thrashing wildly in the mud. 2 men dropped to their knees. They didn't hit him. They just clamped heavy, calloused hands over his shins and knees, pinning his legs to the wet earth with crushing, immovable force. Dex didn't pull a weapon. He didn't say another word. He simply raised his heavy steel-toed boot. The snap of the fibula echoed through the silent woods, sharp and clean, like a thick green branch breaking under a boot heel. Toad's scream was utterly horrific, scattering a flock of crows from the high pines. The men didn't flinch. Dex turned his back on the shrieking, writhing man on the ground and reached into his vest for his cell phone. "Clay," Dex said, holding the phone to his ear, staring blankly at the rising sun. "We got him. He ain't walking." The hospital room smelled like bleach and reheated chicken broth. Toby had been staring at the acoustic ceiling tiles for 3 days. The morphine drip had been removed, replaced by harsh white pain pills that left a chalky, bitter aftertaste in his mouth and a heavy fog in his brain. The pain in his side was a constant burning reality now. It flared every time he shifted his weight, every time he coughed, every time he took a breath deeper than a shallow sip. The stitches pulled tight against his skin, a cruel reminder of how easily human architecture could be compromised. He was watching a muted daytime television show, the bright colors bleeding together, when the heavy oak door to his room pushed open. He expected the nurse with his noon vitals. Instead, Chloe walked in. Toby blinked, trying to clear his medicated vision. He barely recognized her. The heavy black eyeliner was gone, revealing dark, purplish bags under her eyes. She wasn't wearing the leather vest or the oversized hoodie. She wore a simple, faded gray sweater and soft jeans. Without the armor, she didn't look like a hardened highway drifter. She looked like exactly what she was, a 16-year-old girl who had almost been killed. She stood awkwardly at the foot of the bed, her hands buried deep in her pockets. The silence in the room stretched out, thick and uncomfortable, punctuated only by the steady hiss-click of the oxygen unit on the wall. "Hey," she finally said. Her voice was quiet, stripped of the bravado she'd had at the diner. "Hey," Toby croaked back. He reached for the plastic cup of water on his tray table, wincing as the movement sent a sharp spike of fire through his ribs. Chloe flinched, instinctively taking a half step forward as if to help him, then stopping herself. "Does it hurt a lot?" "Only when I exist," Toby managed a weak, dry smile. She didn't smile back. She pulled the plastic visitor's chair, the same one her massive father had occupied days earlier, closer to the bed, and sat down heavily. She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. "My dad said they caught the guy," Chloe said, staring at the linoleum floor. Toby's grip tightened on the plastic cup. A cold shiver rippled down his arms. He remembered the look in Clay's eyes when he said the man wouldn't be a problem anymore. "Did the cops take him?" Chloe finally looked up. Her eyes were dark, carrying a weight that Toby couldn't fully comprehend. "No, the cops didn't find him." The unsaid words hung in the sterile air between them. Toby felt his stomach drop. He had known logically what the club was. He had seen the winged skull. But the reality of it, the permanent, fatal finality of it, was suddenly suffocating. A man was dead, or worse, because Toby had asked for $1.50. "I didn't ask him to do that," Toby whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "I didn't want anyone to get hurt. I just wanted him off you." "I know," Chloe said quickly, her voice cracking. "I know you didn't. You're a good person, Toby. You don't belong in this. You shouldn't have stepped out that door." "Yeah, well, hindsight." Toby leaned his head back against the stiff hospital pillows. He felt overwhelmingly tired. Not sleepy, just exhausted in his bones. "Your dad came in here. He said he paid my hospital bills. He said he owned my wages at the diner." Chloe closed her eyes, resting her chin on her knees. "He considers you club business now. You bled for his blood. In his head, you're family, whether you want to be or not." "I don't," Toby said bluntly. He didn't want to be cruel, but the panic was rising in his throat. He was a kid who played video games and hated pre-calc. He wasn't built for a world where justice was meted out in the woods by men with hammers. "I just want to go back to my boring, stupid life." "You can't," Chloe said softly. It wasn't a threat. It was a tragic statement of fact. "Not completely. They won't bother you. They won't ask you to do anything illegal, but they'll always be there. If someone gives you trouble, they'll step in. If you break down on the side of the road, 3 of them will pull over. You have a shadow now." Toby looked out the narrow hospital window. Outside, the world looked exactly the same. The sky was overcast, the parking lot was full of ordinary cars, and people were going about their mundane Tuesdays. But a pane of glass had shattered between him and that normal world, and he could never put it back together. "I brought you something," Chloe said, breaking the silence. She reached into a canvas tote bag resting on the floor and pulled out a neatly folded bundle of fabric. She stood up and placed it on the edge of his bed. It was a brand new dark blue work shirt, identical to the diner uniform he'd bled through. "I asked the manager at Hank's for a new one," she muttered, avoiding his eyes. "Since the other one got ruined. My dad paid for it, but I picked it up." It was a strange, small gesture, an anchor to the boring, mundane reality he was terrified of losing. Thanks," Toby said, his voice thick. Chloe stood at the side of the bed for a moment longer. She reached out, her fingers hovering for a second before lightly resting on the uninjured side of his blanket. "You saved my life, Toby," she whispered, the tough shell completely broken, leaving only raw, honest gratitude. "I'll never forget it. None of us will." She turned and walked out of the room, her sneakers making no sound on the linoleum. Toby was left alone with the steady beep of the monitor, staring at the neatly folded blue shirt, feeling the invisible heavy weight of the patch he would never wear. The morning of the capture. The old limestone quarry sat 10 miles outside the Oakhaven city limits, surrounded by high chain-link fences topped with rusted barbed wire. It was a vast, gaping wound in the earth, plunging down 200 feet into a basin of milky, stagnant water. The air smelled strongly of chalk dust and stagnant rain. 2 black SUVs and 6 motorcycles were parked on the gravel plateau overlooking the drop. The men stood around in loose clusters, smoking cigarettes, their breath pluming in the freezing morning air. Nobody spoke. In the center of the plateau, kneeling in the white limestone dust, was Toad. His face was a swollen, bloody mess. His nose was broken, and his left eye was swollen shut, a grotesque shade of plum. His denim jacket was torn, soaked through with mud and swamp water, but the worst part was his legs. They jutted out at horrifying, unnatural angles. The fabric of his jeans stretched tight over the broken bones beneath. He wasn't screaming anymore. He was shivering violently, weeping silently, a steady stream of snot and tears trailing into his patchy beard. The crunch of tires on gravel broke the silence. A black modified heavy-duty truck rolled up the dirt access road. It didn't rush. It stopped a few yards away from the group. The engine cut off, and the silence rushed back in, broken only by the wind off the quarry. Clay stepped out of the driver's side. He didn't wear his cut. He wore a heavy black work jacket and thick denim. He walked toward the center of the circle, his face devoid of any emotion. He looked like a man clocking in for a miserable shift at a factory. The circle of men parted for him. Dex stood a few feet from Toad, arms crossed over his massive chest. Clay stopped in front of the kneeling man. He looked down. Toad forced his good eye open, looking up at the giant standing over him. The meth was gone. The adrenaline was gone. There was only the naked, primal understanding that he had reached the end of his timeline. "I'm sorry," Toad whispered, his voice a broken, wet gargle. Blood bubbled on his split lips. "I'm so sorry, man. I was messed up. I didn't mean to." Clay crouched down, his boots grinding into the limestone. He balanced on the balls of his feet, bringing his face level with Toad's. "I believe you," Clay said softly. His voice was jarringly calm, almost conversational. "I believe you didn't mean to. I believe you're a miserable, weak addict who made a bad choice because his brain is rotted out," Toad sobbed, a fresh wave of tears tracking through the dirt on his cheeks. He thought for one desperate second that he was going to hear the word forgiveness. "But the thing is," Clay continued, resting his thick forearms on his knees, "intentions don't matter in this world. Actions matter. You put your hands on my little girl. You took a broken bottle and shoved it into the ribs of a boy who was just trying to do his job." Clay reached into his jacket pocket. He didn't pull out a gun or a knife. He pulled out the heavy silver Zippo lighter. He flipped it open. Clack. He struck the wheel. A bright yellow flame flickered in the gray morning air. He closed it. Clack. "That boy," Clay said, staring at the lighter in his hand, "is lying in a hospital bed with a tube draining blood from his chest. He's 17. He was making minimum wage. He was terrified, but he swung at you anyway, because he has something inside him that you don't." Clay put the lighter back in his pocket. He looked back up at Toad. "I'm not doing this because I'm angry," Clay said, his voice dropping to a dead, icy flat line. "I'm doing this because men like you are a disease, and when a dog gets sick and bites a kid, you don't punish the dog. You put it down, because it's the responsible thing to do." Clay stood up. He turned his back on Toad. He looked at Dex. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Clay walked back to his truck. He didn't look back. He opened the door, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the engine. As he put the truck into gear and rolled down the dirt road away from the quarry, a single sharp crack echoed off the limestone walls behind him. It sounded like a heavy branch breaking. Then there was only the sound of the wind. A week later, the sky over Oakhaven was finally clear. The afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across the peeling paint of the diner's exterior. Hank's 24-hour eatery was closed. A handwritten out-of-order sign was taped to the glass door. Toby stood on the sidewalk across the street. He moved slowly, hunched slightly forward to favor his left side. Underneath a thick flannel shirt, his ribs were tightly bound in medical wrap, the angry red scar still raw and itching with the heat of new tissue. He took a slow, deep breath, testing the limits of his lung capacity. It still burned, a dull ache that the doctor said might linger for months, maybe years. He looked at the empty parking lot. The stains on the asphalt had been washed away by the rain, leaving no trace of the violence that had permanently altered his life. He was alive. He had a clean, folded blue work shirt waiting for him when the diner reopened. He had survived. A low rumble caught his attention. A single motorcycle, entirely blacked out, rolled slowly past the diner. The rider was a mountain of a man in a leather cut. The winged skull patch was clearly visible on his back. The rider didn't stop. He didn't rev his engine aggressively, but as he passed Toby, the man turned his head. He didn't smile, and he didn't wave. He simply raised 2 fingers off the clutch lever in a silent, respectful nod. Toby stood perfectly still. He raised his chin, offering a slight nod in return. The motorcycle rolled down the street, turning the corner and vanishing into the hazy afternoon light, the heavy thrum of the engine fading to a distant heartbeat. Toby turned and started the slow, painful walk home. The fear was still there, sitting cold in his stomach. But as he walked, feeling the phantom weight of a leather vest over his shoulders, he realized the contradiction of his new reality. He had never felt so terrified in his own town. And yet for the first time in his entire life, he had never felt so impossibly, unshakably safe. If you felt the grit, the fear, and the adrenaline of Toby's story, don't let the journey end here. Hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more raw, unapologetic stories about ordinary people thrown into extraordinary chaos. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that real courage isn't the absence of fear. It's stepping up when you're terrified. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Toby's shoes? Stay gritty, stay safe, and we'll see you in the next ride.